Thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. As Scott mentioned, I presented this to the faculty during orientation, and when I spoke to them, I was able to put it in sort of this higher ethical calling about why we need to do this. Now, I also happen to be a parent here. I have a third grader and a sixth grader, so I know the real reason that you're concerned with the topic about educating for the future. In the short term, you want to make sure that when they get out of college, they're not moving back in. Long term, life expectancies are getting longer. You want to make sure that they're able to support you in the way to which you are accustomed. Okay, so we'll kind of have that as the background. We know that's the case. Now we'll start to elevate it onto a higher plane. Educating for the future. Now, all I really want to do for you tonight is to lay out some implications, some ideas, some thoughts, hopefully raise quite a few questions in your mind. It's not to tell you exactly which way we're going. I don't want you to leave here and think, okay, Greenhill is suddenly going down this path. Greenhill is going to suddenly start doing this. These are things that we're struggling with and trying to figure out as we go forward and do a better job of helping your children and preparing them. There's going to be some quizzes along the way, so I hope you're prepared. And before we really get started, I'm going to share a couple quotations with you. And something that when I do presentations, I don't read what's up on the board for you, okay? So you'll just have to look at that. Some of the passages are kind of long. You can just read the highlighted stuff. This is a really, really important concept that I want you to try to keep in mind tonight. This idea of thinking about what may seem like impossible things. This idea of being willing to say, what if? And to think about where things could possibly go. And since we're talking about this book by Daniel Pink, at least as a starting point, this idea about the brain. Now, Emily Dickinson didn't have the advantage of neuroscience at her disposal. But one of the things that we now know, okay, the brain mainly operates through all the connections that it makes, the synaptic connections. Neuroscientists estimate that the number of possible connections that the brain can form is 10 to the 100 trillionth power. It's boggling. 10 to the 100 trillionth power. So it really is, in a sense, wider than the sky. And what adds to that, and what we're going to mainly be talking about tonight, is the idea of the mind, which is something that we still haven't figured out. We can look at the brain and we can find this and this and this, but we can't necessarily figure out what the mind is. It's still sort of the ghost in the machine. Now here comes your first quiz.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
The problem with that video is now I can't watch it without seeing that bear. So then I try to count the passes and I get it wrong every single time because I'm looking at the bear. How many of you have read A Whole New Mind? I'm just curious. There is an example in there that is a wonderful point of what he's making. He gives a little quiz in there which is a multiple choice question. Not one of the answers is correct. But automatically, we think one of them has to be. And I remember looking at it and thinking, that's not right, that's right. I thought, okay, I'm going to pick that one. Knowing I was probably wrong, but we're so conditioned. And really the point behind this is the idea of frameworks. And frameworks limit what we see. We tend to take things and we want them to fit into something that we already know, something that we're comfortable with, and see how they connect and how they all fit together. That's a particularly important concept when you're talking about schools and how schools may need to change and do some things differently. Everybody says they want better schools. There's no question about that. But when they start to look different, people get really nervous about it. This is a guy named Ian Jukes. Ian Jukes is an educational consultant who's based up in Seattle. And he happens to be an expert in how children's brains are changing because of the experiences that they're having. Ian goes all over the country talking to schools and making recommendations to them about what they need to do, how they need to be changing what they do. And he says what infuriates him is everywhere he goes, and he says, well, why are you doing that? And he says he's continually met with what he calls tatwati. Tatwati stands for, that's the way we've always done it. And he gives a story, sort of a long-range history story, to exemplify about how this idea of frameworks and how we've always done it can keep us from doing certain things. I'm assuming that the history in this is correct. I didn't go back and verify it like I probably should have. A train track. A train track between the rails is 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. Big deal. It's 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide because the first train tracks were built over these. These are horse paths dating from medieval times in England. They happen to be about 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. They were 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide because these things were about 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. And where they traveled was where they then built the horse paths and then where they put the rail lines. What that meant was that when they built this to travel places where people hadn't traveled before, they couldn't make all the parts the way they wanted to because they had to transport them via rail and fit it on that 4 foot, 8.5 inch rail. Now, to step outside the history lesson for a while and explain to you how we started thinking about this stuff here at Greenhill in much more depth. Last spring, or I guess all of last year, we went through a branding exercise, the admin team and a group of trustees. And at first, I have to admit, I was very skeptical about this. You know, I was a teacher, and my first thought was, wait, that's business. I don't want to deal with that stuff. And I didn't really understand what this whole branding thing meant. To me, branding meant things like this: logos, trademarks, fraternity tattoos maybe. Okay? But I didn't think about what it really meant. And as we started to go through this, I really kind of started to wonder. And luckily, I didn't have to figure it out myself. And this is what the group came up with. This really, really resonated with me, particularly the last part of it, the thrive in a changing world. Because if you think about it, ultimately, that's what Greenhill's mission is really all about. However you break it down, however you look at it, ultimately, that's what the mission of the school is about. And I would suspect that if we went around the room and said, what do you want for your children? That's basically what it would boil down to. Now, because it was a branding exercise, I was still kind of suspicious about how it was going to get used. I had pictures of things like this happening. Now, I'm going to come back to this branding thing later because I really began to appreciate what we had done and to think about what it means. What it did in the short term, though, was really raise many, many questions for us. You know, this idea of thriving in a changing world. How's the world changing? Where's it going? What does the future hold? What is it going to take to thrive in it? How are you ever going to know if you succeed? I kind of like that last part because I figured nobody could ever hold us to it. But we have an obligation to try. We have an obligation to try to figure it out.